briefly say who I am. I'm one of the careers managers at Recruitment, and we tend to be the people who host these big briefs. And we're delighted that we can do this during this sustainability fair at the same time as COP26. So the Natural History Museum have been running quite a number of engagement activities at COP26, partnering with the New York Times. And so we're really delighted today that we're joined by Dr Douglas Gurr, who is the director at the Natural History Museum. I'll just say a little bit about him. So he was appointed director in December 2020. Previously, he was the country manager of Amazon UK and president of Amazon China. Earlier roles included the civil service, partner at McKinsey and Company, director at Asda Walmart, and founder CEO of internet startup Blue Heath. Doug is also chairman of the British Heart Foundation and non-executive director at the Department of Health and Social Care and former chairman of the Science Museum. He has degrees in mathematics from the University of Cambridge and a PhD in computing from the University of Edinburgh, and previously taught mathematics and computing at the University of Aarhus in Denmark. He's a former Scottish international triathlete, 12 times Ironman, keen ski mountaineer with over 20 first ascents, and an enthusiastic mountain runner, and is married with 2 children. So such a varied and interesting career and such a busy life as well. So I think we've got lots to hear about. So many roles and organisations that I'm sure many people in the audience would be delighted just to have the chance to work in one of these opportunities with one of these employers. So we'll hear about that in a second, but I wanted to just ask you, and I'm sure that the audience are really keen to find out a little bit more about what the museum is doing at COP26. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that, Doug.
Sure, thanks. Hello, hi Katrina, thank you very much. And hello everybody, it's a real pleasure to be here today, and thank you for taking some time to come and listen to us. Yeah, so we've had quite a big team up in Glasgow at COP26. And really we're here to sort of bang the drum for biodiversity and nature. I mean, I think it's, if you know the museum, we're well known as, if you like, as a large visitor attraction. I think what's perhaps less well known is we're also quite a big scientific research institute. So we have over 300 full-time academic scientists researching biodiversity, nature loss, the impact of sort of pollutions on the oceans, and all of these sort of topics. And so bringing those two together, if you like, as I sometimes describe it, our subject matter is planet Earth and life on planet Earth, which is fantastic, quite a broad subject matter. But there is a problem, which is we know that life is under threat. We know that if you look at it, there's no single obvious measure, but if you look at extinction rates, or we look at particular species, or we do studies, we can just see that there's real pressure on life on planet Earth. And we know what the causes are, and one of them is absolutely climate change, but it's also land use. You know, if you cut down tropical rainforest and replace it with soya plantation for beef pasture land, that's quite catastrophic for biodiversity. And we also know it's pollution, particularly the marine environment. So you've got all of these pressures. And I think the main reason we wanted to come to COP was saying, you know, COP is fantastic. There's an enormous focus on carbon, and that's hugely important. And it's great to see that there's so much activity, and it's been really inspiring, I have to say, being up in Glasgow, particularly seeing some of the street activism and some of the real young voices shouting out for that, and that's great. But as we sometimes say, if we stabilize the Earth's temperature, but we've cut down all the rainforests and poisoned all the oceans, we're still not in a great place. So we said, look, let's just make sure somebody's up here to bang the drum for nature. So we've been doing a lot of work, as you mentioned. We're very fortunate that the New York Times have taken a big site, the Climate Hub, not far from the Blue Zone. They asked us to be one of their 3 partners. So we've had a whole team of scientists up here talking about some of these more nature-based impacts. We've been doing some work with the government education department, you know, helping them launch things like the National Educational Nature Park. We actually got very fortunate that one of our very generous sponsors within that sort of climate hub basically said, look, we'll help you to create what we hope will be one of the coolest spaces in Glasgow. So we ran a nature bar all through last weekend with lots of amazing speakers and programming, and got lots of people who were a bit fed up with sitting in the Blue Zone to come in and have a night of free sort of nibbles and drinks and so on, which seemed to go down well. So out there doing a lot of speaking events and just trying, as we say, to just bang the drum for, we're here to make sure that nature doesn't get forgotten in the, you know, the really important, but, you know, climate is one crisis, but actually it's the impact of climate on biodiversity and the other factors that we wanted to make sure was heard. And yeah, so that's what we've been.
Yeah, and I'm sure there might be some questions about that, as well as actually some of the students I'm sure will have been involved in things that have been going on. But first of all, we'll come back to your career story. And at this stage, we usually ask you just to start by giving us a brief history of your career journey. I don't know if you can keep it brief when you've been up to so much.
Sure.
But
Sure. Yeah, so let me have a go. So, I mean, in terms of if you want the 60-second CV, so my parents are Scots, hence the link there. I was actually born for my sins in England. I apologise, but I grew up mostly in Kenya. Came back to the UK to finish sort of school and university. As I said, did a PhD just across the way from you in Edinburgh. Then I started out as an academic, teaching maths and computing in the University of Aarhus in Denmark. I gave that up, came back to the UK, worked for the civil service for a couple of years, gave that up. You'll see there's a sort of thread of giving things up here. Went into consultancy, which at that point I was interested in business. So I worked for McKinsey for a number of years, became a partner. Then there was this thing called the internet, which was just coming along, which, believe it or not, was newish, 20 odd years ago. So I quit that and did an internet startup, did that for 5 years, took it from nothing to a couple of 100 million turnover, floated it, sold it. I then decided I wanted to work for sort of a bigger business. So I worked for Asda for a while on the board there, gave that up, joined Amazon, did about 9 years in Amazon, a couple of years in the UK as a number 2. I then moved to Beijing and ran our businesses in China for 3 years, and then came back and ran the UK business. So that, if you like, was my very straightforward, from academia to public service through quite a long commercial sort of role. I'd always in parallel tried to do some sort of, if you like, some non-profit, non-executive stuff on the side. So, I've been very interested in museums for a number of years. So I was a trustee and then the chair of the Science Museum in London. Also been very interested in healthcare. So hence chairing the British Heart Foundation, which is a medical research charity looking at cardiovascular disease. More recently, joined the board of the Department of Health in the UK, initially to help them with the vaccine program, doing the technology and the logistics for the rollout. So I've had, if you like, that commercial day job, sort of non-profit stuff on the side. And then just over a year ago, decided it was time to sort of reverse that. So I now have a non-profit day job running a museum, which I have to say is the best job I've ever had. And so and obviously we're not allowed to sort of pitch particular roles here, but if you love interesting about science or public engagement and so on, it's a brilliant place to work. And then I'm still doing a lot of the healthcare work on the side, bits and pieces. So yeah, that's me. So as you can see, there's no absolute clear solid golden thread that runs through that says this, but it's been, if you like, trying to work at the intersection of both.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. No, well, there's not a particular thread or factor that links the roles.
No, it's a tricky one because very often when you have conversations with people, and you do sometimes meet people and they can say to you, look, from an early age, I was absolutely clear this is what I wanted to do, and everything just took me in that one direction. I really wanted to be a doctor, or I really wanted to work in international development, or whatever it is. In my experience, that's relatively rare these days. You don't meet many people to be so clear, and certainly there wasn't for me. So I've had, if you like, always a, does it look interesting at the time? Am I going to learn something from it? Is it building a skill set I don't particularly have? But I've always wanted to try and do things that can have some form of impact. And I always had a view that. Even though I'd spent a lot of time in the commercial world, and one of the things I quite enjoyed is having a foot in the commercial world, if you like, the public sector and also the charity sector. But ultimately, to some extent, it was always about, you tend to learn a pretty good skill set of toolkit in the commercial world, but it was saying, how can we deploy that back to organizations like the Natural History Museum, where, if you like, the mission is so, it sounds a little bit things, but it genuinely is, can we help turn the dial and solve the biodiversity crisis? But can we actually bring some of those skills you've hopefully picked up in the commercial world or digital world to try to bear on these problems that really matter?
And I think we see as career advisors increasingly that the world of work is more flexible, that you can move around, and that's going to continue in the future. So it's something that we try to encourage students to be aware of and to not worry too much about. Would you have any advice for students preparing for this more flexible approach?
So I think it's hard because, as you say, to some ways our educational system, right from a very early age, is sort of predicated on this very clear path. You do this step, then you jump over the next hurdle, and then you do the next step. And a lot of, if you like, some careers still have that characteristic. If you want to go and train as a lawyer or a doctor or an accountant, or those professions, if you like, that tends to be okay, carry on studying, get a qualification, there's a promotion ladder. I think the challenge is that starts increasingly to break down. And if you talk to even somebody who's gone through one of those professions, once you've reached partner or consultant as a medic or whatever, where do you go next? And you can be a little bit lost when there isn't that obvious next thing. I think increasingly what we're seeing in the world of work, and by the way, that's regardless of whether it's in the commercial world or the public sector or the charity world. I think there's much more commonality, I would say, from my observations of those three than there are differences. Well, what you're really saying is we know that the nature of work is changing very radically. We know that it's very difficult to actually say the skill sets you have today are going to be guaranteed to be the ones that will still be relevant in 5 years' time, let alone 10 years' time.
Yeah.
So actually, increasingly, I think you've got to sort of think through in whatever role you take from what is this going to teach me? Well, what skills are going to learn? And broadly speaking, that generic skills of, do I understand how to manage and lead people? Do I know how to get things actually done operationally? Do I know how to speak effectively and communicate a message? Do I know how to work with technology? Do I understand finance? It's almost actually, I'm saying, most of the conversations I have with people, I worry a little bit less about the particular role because domain knowledge can always be taught. What you're trying to learn, if you like, is those good generic skills and bring to the workplace an absolute commitment to lifelong learning. The people who tend to do best come in every day saying, what a great day, I learned something new or I developed a new skill. And because, you're going to need that, I think, going forward because, things change, new stuff comes along. It's one level you'd say it's exhausting, another level it's completely exhilarating. And if you love learning, you're probably well placed to do well in the workplace as it evolves.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about the concept of career resilience. So one of the key factors there is lifelong learning and also opening up your network so that you're aware of opportunities. And another one, as well as being flexible, is taking planned risks. Is that something you've done in your career?
Yeah, I think you have to, because in a sense, there's you're going to learn the most when you move into a new environment, and either you move to try and work in a new country. So I mean, a good example was, I moved to China to lead the team there, and China's quite complicated. And I moved out there not speaking a word of Mandarin, and we had about 6,000 people in the team, and I think including me, there were 11 expats. So it was a very Chinese team. It was a very complicated environment. China's, for those of you who've had the opportunity to go, it's an extraordinary, amazing place to work. But wow, are you on a steep learning curve? It's insanely complicated from a regulatory point of view, trying to get your head around how do you operate an environment, which at one level is sort of the most, in your face, commercial, entrepreneurial, in a hurry place you've ever been, but it's bolted onto this communist police state. I mean, it's just very unusual. And so actually in that situation where you're saying, I've got certain experiences I've had, but you learn so fast in those situations because you've suddenly got to think about how do you engage with a team, how do you work, in a second language, how do you learn Mandarin quickly so you can start to be credible with the team, all of those sort of things. What I would say is there are different dimensions in which you can change. So, a new organization, that's a big change. A new type of role, that's a big change. A move to the next level of leadership, that's a big change. Trying to change all of those in one go is quite challenging, particularly with other things going on in your personal life. So it's usually best to sort of have some form of, okay, it's a new country, but it's the same organization. So at least I know a little bit about that, and it's the same broad role. So I think, it's what I would call managed risk, and that you're changing one dimension quite radically, but you've still got a sort of anchor you can fall back on. Okay, a completely new role in the same organization is pretty good. A completely, the same role in a completely new organization is pretty good. Trying to do all of these things at the same time when you've got other things going on in your personal life, that's when I think people can get a little bit spread too thin.
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously been a big challenge. Have there been other key challenges that you feel you faced in your career? How did you deal with them?
I think always. I mean, there are the day-to-day, if you work in any large organization, as you used to like to say. I had a very wise sort of boss mentor who said to me one day when I was getting quite stressed about a situation, he said, look, you work in a large organization, something terrible is going to happen somewhere in the organization. And the longer you go in the career and further up, the more those things bubble up. So just get used to the fact there's a crisis every day, and just, get good at dealing with crises, and then they won't be crises anymore. So there was a little bit of that, which actually was quite helpful. I think the other bit, though, is, there are plenty of situations where you have to make a transition. I mean, there's, in some ways, I always think of, there's a model I found quite helpful, which is there are sort of, if you like, four different levels we all have to work through. We mostly start our careers and we mostly go through the education system as what you might call individual contributors, in which we're assessed or rewarded mostly based on what do I actually do myself? Did I write a great essay? Did I do a brilliant experiment? In the workplace, it's what did I myself actually do? And then you have to go through a transition when you go from an individual contributor to a manager, in which you're assessed less around what you personally are doing, more around what is the team of people for whom you're responsible doing. And then there's another transition where you go from manager to leader, which is, a manager on the whole is, can you organize this group of individuals to deliver this outcome? But the goal is typically set within a given framework. Leader is more, here's a blank sheet of paper, go solve it. You've got to shape the strategy, you've got to decide the team, you've got to do these. And then there's one final transition when your job is to lead leaders, and that's a whole different skill set. And the challenge is at every stage of these transitions, good news is you only have to do it 3 times. Individual contributor, you're mostly pretty good at, otherwise you wouldn't be here studying at a world-leading university. But you've got to learn to be a manager, you've got to learn to be a leader, you've got to learn to be a leader of leaders. And at each stage, it's a completely different skill set. And it's even worse than that, because very often the things that make you a brilliant individual contributor can hold you back as a manager. You don't want to delegate, you don't want to let go, you can't deal with the fact that, there are just all of these things that, behaviors that can be incredibly successful at one level become actually unhelpful at the next level. And for me, some of the biggest challenges in the workplace have been when you just made that transition and it's just not working. And it's just not working because you're doing the things that have always made you, that have given you success in the past. And suddenly you're in this awful situation where doing the things you've done before that worked for you are best not working, and at worst, in many cases, being actively counterproductive. So those become the situations where you go, oh my goodness, I've got no idea. I don't know what I'm doing here. And that's the point when you really do need to, it's a little bit back to your lifelong learning point, Katrina, lifelong learning, and also understanding when it's the right time to reach out for help. That's when mentors can really help you. That's when coaching can really help you. That's when actually just acknowledging that actually I don't really know what I'm doing here can really help you, because those are the points at which you've got a chance of actually fighting them.
Nice words, thank you. Let's go back to actually look at your career choices when you were younger. We'll ask a couple of questions about that, and then I think we'll go in and look at some of the questions from the students. So when you were leaving school, you decided to go into a mathematics degree. What was it that led you into that? I'm guessing it wasn't maybe particular career choices. Was it more study of mathematics?
No, it certainly wasn't career choices. I mean, honestly, I didn't really think about careers for a long time. I'll tell you the story of when I first went to visit the equivalent of the career service at the time. No, I think I went into mathematics, I think perhaps naively because I just love the subject. I mean, mathematics in some ways is, it's the study of the underlying patterns and structures in nature. I was it was one of those subjects I did well at school, so it felt natural to follow that. And I just thought it had a certain beauty, and there is a beauty in creativity. And so, that took me from school to saying, actually, I really want to study this subject. That's part of it. If I'm completely honest, if you step back a little bit earlier, so I actually went through secondary school in the English system, not the Scottish system, which, as you'll know, is, so we don't have journals, we have these A levels, and A levels are really quite problematic because you only get to choose 3. So I remember I just finished my O levels, as it was then, GCSEs, as I guess it would be now. And my family were not particular mathematicians. My mother, ironically, had done a degree joint honours in English and mathematics, which you could do back in the day. Whereas these days, in the English system, we force people at the age of 16 to say, are you a scientist or a humanities liberal arts, which is crazy and completely crazy from speaking as an employer these days or anybody in the workplace. You need both. Why do we think it's fine to be brilliant at one and not the other? But there we were. So I just done my O levels and I had to go into the school and meet the deputy head and just say, what are you going to study? And I was sitting there honestly saying, look, I could do further maths, physics, chemistry, which I ended up doing, or I could do English, French, history, art. And I was genuinely quite torn between the two. And my father was a professor of English literature, and teaching at the university at the time, in the department there. And I went to him and said, oh, Dad, what do you think? Whatever. And he looked at me like I was completely stupid. And he said, none of my students can get jobs, do maths. So there was a bit of that. Now, I'm pleased to say the world has moved on a long way. So anybody who's studying an arts degree, don't worry, we'll employ you. We love arts degrees, they're fantastic. But actually for me, it was that sort of actually is what tilted me that direction. It could easily have gone the other way. In some ways it was, as I've said, I think it was a really false choice at that stage. It was too early and too aggressive a narrowing of options. And certainly my experience as an employer is actually quite problematic, that you now bring people into the workplace who've spent perhaps 3 or 4 years just studying the sciences or just studying the arts. And then you arrive in the workplace, and it doesn't matter whether that workplace is the government or commercial or charitable. You go, well, actually, we kind of need you to be able to write and add up. So, if you've not done maths for 3-4 years, we're going to have to try and fix that for you. And if you've only studied the scientists and you haven't written an essay for a while, we're going to have to try and fix that for you. So I would urge everybody, whichever side you're going, to try and find a way to keep that other thread going, because it'll be more comfortable going to the workplace if you've been studying an art subject, that if at least you've stayed up with, read some of the scientists or study what's going on in the COP, all of these things. Equally, if you're a scientist, for goodness sake, keep reading books, keep writing. You're going to need those skill sets. So anyway, that's my own personal bias on this one, if you like.
Although, I mean, I think we do say to students that when they come to open days, it's look at what you enjoy as well as what you're good at. I mean,
totally.
So long as you enjoy it, it's likely to sustain you through. You're able to study and keep that going.
No, I'm really pleased you said that, because one of those things you do see, again, a conversation you have, if you're thinking about where should I go, what role should I take, I actually think it's really hard to give of your best every day if you don't love what you do. And occasionally you meet people who just say, well, this kind of feels like the right career move, or it'll look good on my CV, or I'll do whatever, I'll take this. But you say, if you're not going to enjoy the day-to-day experience, if you're not excited about the subject matter, if you don't think you're going to enjoy the people you're working with, if you don't think you're going to learn, if the day-to-day experience isn't fun, I think you're going to really struggle to give of your best. And typically, and then those people who find their passion early tend to pursue it and do brilliantly. Others sort of discover it a little bit later on, but I think it's a super important lens. I'm really pleased you're giving that guidance. I think it's so important.
And I think it fits in as well with a lot of employers actually using strengths-based recruitment now, so they don't just want to find people who can do the job well, but actually really enjoy it.
Totally. I mean, there was an old, back in my, I worked for Asda for a while, which was part of the Walmart group at the time, and it was a really inspiring organisation to work for, because most of the people we brought into the organisation weren't particularly, some of them had come from quite disadvantaged backgrounds. They wouldn't necessarily have been graduates or highly educated, and the vast majority of people, were coming into, hourly paid part-time jobs or jobs often on not much more than minimum wage. And yet, 70% of all managers at Walmart globally came from people who come up as hourly paid associates and just did brilliantly all the way through, and some extraordinary performers. And it really came back to a very simple mantra, which was you hire for attitude and you train for skill. Bright, smart, motivated people can be taught to do pretty much anything in terms of skills, but we're not that interested in domain knowledge. We can teach that. You can't teach attitude. And those who come in with a positive attitude, a willingness to learn, those are the ones who go well. And part of that attitude is, if you come in thinking you're going to enjoy it, you're probably going to enjoy it. And people will respond to that, and you'll probably do well. If you come in convinced this is going to be a miserable experience, then that can be quite self-fulfilling as well.
Yeah, I mean, increasingly a lot of graduate schemes are open to people of any discipline, which is good. It means that people don't have to think too early on. They can just focus on developing skills while they're at university, as well as doing their subject, but develop the transferable skills in things that they enjoy. So were there any activities that you did while you were at university you're aware of now that actually was really good skills development aside from the studies?
Yeah, no, great question. So I spent a fair amount of my extracurricular time at university, I'm afraid, doing sport of one form or another, and spent many happy hours sort of cycling up and down the Scottish hills and doing all of that. But it also got me into a little bit more of the climbing, expeditioning, etc. I mean, I've left backdrop on because that's a fjord in Norway where we were fortunate to spend a week 3 years ago before lockdown, but just in a little hut skiing and mountaineering and climbing. But actually that was an area where and you'll know, any of your students who spend time out in the hills or in Glasgow or Edinburgh in my case or whatever, just that's how do I think it taught me two really interesting things. There's a certain amount of skill sets in terms of self-sufficiency, reliance, having to be aware of your surroundings as well as learning things like navigation, etc. But it was also really quite a compelling lesson, if you like, in terms of, how do we assess and judge people? So, for example, when I was doing a lot of triathlon, honestly, nobody in that world cares whether if you're a student or you're a bricklayer or you're a nurse or you're a chief executive. They just care whether you're fast. So actually it's a totally different value system that just reminds you that, just don't be too one-dimensional on what you think you need. Actually, there are many different skills out there, and I think to have to deliver well and have impact over the course of a life, and a lifetime is a long period. You may work for different organizations, different roles. Actually just thinking through what's that broader skill set, whether it's learning how you work effectively in teams and so on. And the academic university training is fantastic. I wouldn't want to in any sense not urge people to follow the passion, go deep, love your subject. It will teach you amazing disciplines and skill sets. But actually your extracurricular is often your best opportunity to learn things like, well, how do I do public speaking or debating, or how do I work in teams, or how do I do all of this? And you can do that whether it's through theatre, or if you want to volunteer in a museum, we have many opportunities, or whether it's through the arts, or whether it's through sport. These are all brilliant things to do because they'll give you that sort of orthogonal set of skill sets. I feel like I'm preaching a lot about skills at the moment, but it's certainly in my perspective as somebody who does a lot of employer, that's kind of what we care about. What is the skill set this individual brings is so much more important than what particular domain knowledge do they have in the back of their head.
No, it's great to hear you say that, because I think it means so much more when it comes from you than it does from us, because it's just helping it sink into students that, absolutely, go and do other things while you're there, take on a part-time job, but also
totally. And again, just and again, as I've worked for organizations that hire an enormous number of graduates, and we really care about what else have you done, because it's you want evidence of people who've got a bit of leadership, got a bit of the get up and go. So, and very often that can be exhibited best through some of the extracurricular activities you've done. If you volunteered to be the treasurer of the Film Society, or you've gone and volunteered and done some work with sort of kids in an underprivileged part of the city. That's often what sort of impresses and catches the eye of potential employers. And by the way, it also gives you something really interesting to talk about in an interview. And people want to be memorable and remembered and all of those things. So and you'll do that best when you talk about something you're passionate about, and sometimes that can be something that you've chosen to pursue as your extracurricular. So occasionally I see CVs of people and they've just stripped all of that off, and you think, why did you do that? That's some of the best stuff you've got.
So then you went on after your undergraduate, you went on to do a PhD. So that was at Edinburgh. So what was it that appealed to you about doing a PhD, or was it the particular project? Was it the idea of PhD?
It's a great question. It's a great question. I mean, I think it was. I'd love to say. I think a little bit of it was just. I really enjoyed what I was doing. I loved it, and I was curious to go further and go deeper. And it was round about the time when, some of the early stages of what have now become routine stuff about the way in which logic and computing and mathematics all came together were just getting going. So it was just a very exciting period in that sort of academically, intellectually very exciting period. And so I think there was a big part of that. I was interested. If I'm completely honest, I think there was also a little bit of it, which was, it was the next thing to do, if you know what I mean. So I don't think I was genuinely don't think I was particularly thoughtful about what other options might have been out there. I just said, well, I've done an undergraduate, I did the master's, of course you go and do the PhD next, simply because it was there. I think probably if I had my time again, I loved doing the PhD. I think I learned a ton from it. It was great, and it gave me the chance to live in Edinburgh, which I completely loved. Apologies to Glasgow, but it's Scotland, it all counts, But it was. I think, maybe there were other parts, and it's not to say one is better or worse. I just think, actually, if I'm completely honest, I wasn't perhaps as thoughtful as I might have been about what some of the other options might have been. And, I think if I was going through it again now, I think I'd probably at least have explored more broadly before necessarily committing to that, 7 years head down, pure narrow academic path.
Yeah, but then, I deal with the research students at Glasgow, and I say to them, look, think about it as work experience, high-level work experience. You're a researcher, you're a project manager, and so long as you are passionate about that project and can really commit to it and put a lot into it, you'll gain so much from it that you can take into so many areas.
And I think that's absolutely true. I mean, I can guarantee you that in my case, that 7 years of training in structured pattern recognition, mathematical logical thinking, and I use that every single day. And, I had to go and infill a few gaps in my own training, and actually the civil service taught me how to write. That was super helpful. So, actually, when I look at all, I mean, at one level you'd say you've been all over the place, but I can point to experience and things I've taken for every single one of those roles that mean that when you end up in the last sort of, for quite a few years now, I've ended up leading organizations. And actually, if you lead an organization, you've got to be able to do the whole thing. You have to be able to think about, how do we deliver the operation? How do we do the longer term thinking and planning? How do you lead the people and build the right culture you want, and the behaviors and the values? How do you do all the external facing stuff, pictures? And actually, I think, I feel very fortunate. I've had a breadth of experience that enables I can draw all those things for every day. And I go back every day to like, oh yes, just as well. I remember that. Turns out doing sums is quite helpful as well at some point in your career.
And often when you look back, can feel more like linear progression maybe than it did at the start or when you were moving, can't it?
No, I mean, each of the moves made sense at the time. It felt like a logical move, but it's just, and I don't know if we've got any sort of computer scientists on the call, but there's something called the greedy algorithm in graph theory, which is you choose the thing that looks that looks best at this moment. Doesn't necessarily give you the ultimate best path through the graph, but it can take you some interesting places. And I feel very privileged that it's given me the opportunity to work all around the world and to work with extraordinary individuals and very often to do some really fun stuff. So,
absolutely.
Not that every single day for looking back 25, 30 years on has been completely brilliant, but the balance of good days has way outweighed the bad days. And during it, a question I sometimes ask people, which is, if you look back to the last 12 months, think back to the last 12 months, which were the days over that past 12 months when you came out of it and you just thought that was a fantastic day. I just loved it.
That's a good way to look at it.
And there's actually very often, and there might be only one or two or three, I hope it's at least one. But if there's been at least a couple of fantastic days, you sort of think, well, why don't we try and shape the next stage so I can have more days like that and create more opportunities like that? And those are the kind of moments we live for in some ways. And it can come from lots of different things. It can come from, as I mentioned, sporting success or academic success or teamwork or often pulling through those tough situations or even just spending time with friends and family. But if you think about those days when you look backwards, you loved, you want to think about your next role as at least creating the opportunity to have more of those. And conversely, if you look back over the last 12 months and haven't been any of those, then maybe it's time to think about doing something different.
That is a good sign. We'll just go into some of the questions. There was quite a lot coming in from the students, so I'll just take them in order. So I'd like to ask, given your employment journey, whether you would consider the Natural History Museum to be more business or public service?
Yeah, so good question. I mean, look, it's first and foremost the Natural History Museum, like all of these things. This is an organisation created for the public good. It's very, it's been around for a long time. As I say, our mission is our mission today is incredibly simple. We want to create advocates for the planet, and that means inspiring millions, and then tens of millions, and then hundreds of millions of people to care about the natural world and want to do enough about that natural world to protect it. That's what we're there for. That's our mission. That's what gets people up in the morning, gets them excited and passionate. Now, to deliver that mission, that means we need to have an organization that can fund itself. So we need some commercial income. We do need the cafes and the coffee shops and the scientific consulting and so on, because otherwise we can't get there. We have to be able to attract, brilliant, talented scientists, and we compete with every university on the planet for this. We absolutely have to look after the collections. There's a whole lot of things you have to do, but the mission is completely, uncompromising and unsimple. It's bluntly here. We are here to look after and protect nature. That's kind of what we do. And frankly, the reason I joined was because actually it was interesting. Museums have always, if you like, seen themselves to some extent as collectors, cataloguers, researchers, conservators, but you could argue relatively passive observers of what's going on. And it's interesting, if you read the literature we were producing in the 70s, 80s, 90s, in the year 2000s, it all pretty much came along the lines of, we must go out and observe and collect and preserve nature before it's too late. So our scientists knew that the extinction crisis was coming, could see this happening, didn't quite feel much of a sense of agency that we could do anything about it. So if you like, it was quite a passive role. And then the museum took a decision just over 18 months ago to say, well, actually, if your subject matter is life and it's under that much threat, then being a passive observer is no longer sufficient. You know, if you like, if you want the sporting analogy, it's time to get off the sidelines and onto the pitch. We want to do something about it. And if you have, what can we do? Well, it turns out if you have a big public voice, 5 million visitors, 20 million unique digital visitors, it's quite a trusted voice because we're not a commercial organization, we're not a government agency, we're an independent body with credible science. And you have science, you know what the solutions are. If you bring that together, that's what took us to saying, well, look, what we think we can do is create advocates, you know. And it's very unusual to find organizations that have both a big scientific research base and a public communication voice, and that's one of the things that makes us, I think, relatively unusual, and at least one of the relatively few institutions that has the opportunity to try and move the needle and turn up at COP and get visibility and do these things. And frankly, that's why I joined. I looked at that and just thought, brilliant. I'd always loved museums. You know, I hope I can bring something from the skill set I developed in all those different roles. But I joined because I got excited about that mission. And I think the whole team's pretty excited about that.
There's quite a few questions around working in the museum. So let me just have a look. And something I was going to ask about, you know, what advice you could give if they want to join it's over 300 people, isn't it? Over 300
so
scientists.
We're about 1,950 people in total. There's 300 full-time scientists, but then of course we have public education, learning, commercial, etc. A massive range of sort of activities. You know, if you want to come work for the museum, honestly, the best thing to do if you want to work in the museum sector is come in and volunteer. We have huge opportunities for people who can either be visitor facing, front of house scientific explainers, you know, sit there, and we have brilliant people who come and do that. We have people who work on the collections. We have a lot of what we call scientific associates. In fact, you may have seen you know, people who come in and study the back catalogue and discover new species and things like this. There are lots of opportunities. We're always looking for people who can help us. We've got some fantastic youth advisory panels because there's always a danger in these organisations that we get. Some of us have been around too long and we're not very good at really understanding what's going to appeal to the 18 to 25-year-olds and how do we get those in. So there are many, many opportunities. I think it's a great example, back to your point about extracurricular, Katrina. You know, there are brilliant museums in Glasgow.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's fantastic. Go and spend a bit of time, volunteer, do this. That will give you a feel for what the museum life is like for different things. And off the back of that, you'll develop, you know, it'll impress anybody if you try and apply for a role that you've already shown an interest and a passion. It'll give you a better feel for what the museum is like, and you'll create a whole lot of network contacts and things who can often help you sort of the way through.
We've got loads, we've got, you know, the Hunterian Museum on our doorstep.
You've got brilliant museums.
Loads of
brilliant
covering loads of different subject areas depending on what you're interested in. So absolutely, I would agree. Volunteering work and even part-time paid work in some cases, summer work and lots that you can do. A few people are asking about that in terms of the qualifications. I assume for like the science roles, you're looking really for PhD level, are you?
It varies. No, we have so you can study for a PhD. We've got 176 PhD and master students.
Oh, really?
Right. On top of those 300 scientists. So if you're interested in this area, and now we're not a degree awarding body, partly because, and that's partly a conscious choice, because effectively what we'll do if somebody wants to come and do a PhD with us, we'll have one of our scientists to supervise, and then we'll co-supervise typically with a different academic institution. That means we can work with lots of different academic institutions, not just across all 4 nations of the UK, but around the world. We can bring in students from Columbia, etc. But it gives you the ability to work on the collections, to use all the big machinery, the molecular facilities, the scanning electron microscopes. There's a huge amount of work going on in areas like environmental DNA at the moment, or you know, biodiversity monitoring and things like that. So that's actually not a bad way into it, and you can do either masters or PhDs. I mean, there are a few courses, I would say, in sort of museum studies.
Yes, you know, we have one at Glasgow.
Yeah, which is brilliant. And those are fantastic, but it's not necessary to have done that. You can pick this stuff up and learn on the job, regardless of what your sort of undergraduate specialist.
Would that be more for? Someone's asked about curation. Would that be more for the curation jobs?
It varies. So curation is an interesting one because you know, different museums sort of have different types of curators. I mean, curation after the collection, so it can be quite a technical scientific discipline. It can involve actually, if you work at the British Museum, a lot of it is about, well, how do I actually maintain, protect and preserve a 3,000-year-old Egyptian artifact? What are the right conditions? for us, where we're looking at specimens, some of which have to be stored cryogenically frozen or something, it can be that. Sometimes curation means what it means, which is typically you've got these vast collections. How do you understand them, research them, learn them, all that sort of stuff? If you worked at, I was a trustee at the National Gallery for a while, you're effectively an art historian as you create there, a smaller number of collections, but equally they have unbelievable conservation scientists who can rebuild and reconstruct 14th century icons. So it can cover a whole lot of things, but at its heart, it's somebody who's passionate about working with the collection. And museums, first and foremost, are defined by their collections. So if your passion is, 18th century or 14th century kind of like iconography or art museums are brilliant. If you're interested in the history of fabrics or technology, as for V&A type stuff, obviously National Museum Scotland or the Hunterian has extraordinary things like this. And but again, I would say, look, you'll have curators, all of those museums, if you go and chat to them and volunteer, they're always invited to come and show you stuff. And if you ask nicely, curators will take you behind the public stuff and show you the amazing stuff that's hidden behind the scenes. If you want to see all the things that Darwin brought back on the Beagle, they mostly sit in our basement and things like this, because that sort of extraordinary iconic objects.
Someone's asked a very interesting question. Where do you see the overlap between art and natural history conservation, as many natural history objects are chemically similar to arts objects?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and it's such a good question. And actually, so I could give you two different takes on this, one of which is, our head of earth sciences was saying to me at the end, ultimately it's all about, the earth scientists, they're the geologists, they're these things, the plate tectonics people. They say, look, it's all about the earth. This life stuff is just a recent scattering that sits on top, and art is you're just rearranging molecules and things like this. So I think that's one perspective. The other perspective I quite liked, I was having a chat with Hartwig Fischer, who's the director of the British Museum, the other day, and we were talking about, where does nature, culture, nature interact? So for example, British Museum is about to put on, I think it may have just opened, an exhibition on Peru. And British Museum is about human cultural artifacts. We're about natural historical artifacts. But these two are very closely interwoven in the sense that, all of the poetry, the literature, the pottery, the design, and Peruvian thing is inspired by nature, and vice versa. So actually you've got this incredible interlinking. In fact, I did this event for the New York Times last week where we were talking about storytelling, and that's where it really comes through. So I think you'll find, massive interweaving in which the inspiration often comes from nature, but actually our ability to tell stories about this. And whilst museums are defined first and foremost by their collections, we know that an object in a museum becomes so much more powerful when we start to tell stories about that. And that's where you really need to bring in some of the, the human artistic sort of interpretation. And an object does not sit in isolation. It was who collected it, how did they do that, what was the impact on human life in a particular part of the world. So which is another way of saying, look, I actually think we get the best when we start to interweave science and arts and those cultures. And you can go back and read your C.P. Snow from way back when. We shouldn't, the two cultures is not the way we should think about this. It's all human activity.
Yeah. And quite a few people asking about conservation and climate crisis. So do you think that voice is enough given the state of climate crisis? Has the museum considered pledging proceeds to help climate refugees or to fund conservation efforts?
Yeah, so do I think we're doing enough at the moment? I think we're all worried that the current, I think we're very clear that the current trajectory is not sustainable. And again, we're not climate scientists per se. Our expertise is in biodiversity. But if anybody's got a few spare minutes, you can read the Dasgupta report, which came out a few months ago, which really asked that question of, is it possible to tread that path in which you can still allow people around the world reasonable expectations of better life? And particularly, I think you cannot say in the developed world, we're fine, developing world, you just freeze progress and stay in poverty forever. That's unsustainable. So how do you meet the reasonable aspirations of people for better life and economic growth, particularly in the developed world and developing world? And we've heard a lot about that during COP, which has been great. But can you do it in such a way that doesn't over-consume the Earth's natural resources? That's the fundamental question that Dasgupta asked. The good news, and it is good news, is that the answer is yes. There is a path in which we can still allow a reasonable level of economic growth, but we can do it in a way that doesn't over-consume the natural resources. A very narrow path. And we need to take action right now to start getting on that path. And that's why, Part of it, of course, is limiting heating to 1.5 degrees. But equally as important is the work we're doing to protect the oceans. If you look at toxins, microplastics, these things, we could destroy the oceans. If we do that, we lose the whole planetary ecology. And then the other massive big one here is land use. So if you think about the habitable Earth surface, so strip out deserts and glaciers and cities and lakes, more than half of the Earth's land surface is now agriculture. Some of that is crops, the majority of it is actually either animal pasture or feed for those. And again, back to that point, if you cut down tropical rainforests, highly diverse, and you replace it with monoculture agriculture, you've got a catastrophe. So it's fixable. And this is the conclusion does go up to, there is a path, but it requires action from everybody, us, individual people, corporates, and ultimately governments. But that action taken together, and that's really what we're going for. That's our mission is, if we can do that, we can get here. And for those of you who have the opportunity, we've started putting this much more into our public programming. So we launched an exhibition we've called Our Broken Planet, how we got here, but also crucially ways to fix it. That was initially an online only exhibition. It's now live as a physical exhibition. I'd encourage anybody who has the chance to come and see it. And it's really all about what can I do as an individual, and what we can do as individuals is make some changes to our life. And we're not saying unreasonable changes. We're not saying you must go vegan. That's unrealistic. But we are saying if at the margins you could trade down one beef for one chicken or things, that would really help. And it's about how do we eat, how do we travel, what do we consume? And that collective action is enough. We do enough on that. We do enough on protecting the areas that are protecting of this. The good news is there is that path, but it's a narrow path. And the longer we wait, the narrower that window comes in which we can turn the curve and biodiversity loss.
And I mean, I suppose a lot of the students are already involved in these issues. Do you have any advice to those who actually want to devote their career to fighting climate change or biodiversity?
Yeah, no, I actually think I'd only have one piece of advice, which is just do it. I mean, actually, there is absolutely no doubt that the youth voices have been one of the most powerful mobilizers to get people to move, because there are always reasons. If you're a politician, if you're a corporate, you're quite constrained, you're worried. But we know that companies will move when they hear their customers wanting to move. We know that governments will move when they hear their citizens asking for change. And actually, one of the things that's been really, really genuinely powerful is those youth voices and throwing yourself into this, choosing these things. And the good news is I think now you're beginning to get a little bit of momentum. And I don't want to be complacent remotely about this, but actually to make that transition to decarbonize an economy, to actually turn the curve on biodiversity loss, we're going to need lots of people moving into these areas. So, if you're passionate about that, as I think you said it earlier on, follow the thing you love and you're passionate about. And I think there is genuine optimism here that the more young people, the more graduates from a university like Glasgow, a great university, that we can get into these areas, the more likely it is that industry or government or corporates will actually start coming up with solutions that are based on, preserving nature and stabilizing climate than if, you go and work for an organization that's perhaps more in the older world.
So some of them have asked about, did you work towards environmentalist goals in your previous job? Someone asked about how do you do that when you work for someone like Walmart? Is that something
so I think it's so the short answer is absolutely yes. I mean, there's always it's easy to demonize the different organizations. I would say, in my experience, and I can work there, most corporates are actually full of pretty well-intentioned people. They sort of need to know what they should do. So if you look at things like Amazon was very early with the climate pledge, fully renewables, doing all these sort of things, climate friendly products. Most of these organizations will move, but they need to hear from their customers that that's what we want them to do, because otherwise they're constrained by shareholders and so on. And the single most effective thing you can do is just almost give them permission. And certainly in all the conversations, I have lots of conversations with corporate leaders, there's an absolute open door for us to push through. But the more they can justify that to their shareholders and stakeholders in terms of this is what our customers want us to do, the more likely it is we'll get everybody moving. And that's why it has to be a movement. And that's why we're so thrilled to just see sort of the bottom-up activism and some of the stuff, I mean, we were very privileged. Greta came and visited us in the museum just before coming up to GLOP, and the actions that she's taken, or Vanessa, or those folk, is really powerful. And all the the amazing activists we see around, particularly those youth activists, you are the voice that will persuade the rest of us like us to sort of get our act together here.
Someone's asked quite an interesting question. I think this is worth mentioning. How do you balance your private life, such as family and sports, with your career? Do you feel it is a trade-off?
It's a great question. I actually don't. So I'll tell you how I do it. It's not the only way to do it, but I'm a sort of goalsy type person. So I'm a great believer in balance. So I've always said that the way I tend to think about it is, what are you doing in your professional career? What are you doing, friends and family? I like something that keeps, if you like, my intellectual part life. I've always wanted to do something that's a non-profit giving back, and then say, what am I learning? So I tend to sort of say to myself, okay, I'd like to sort of think across those 5 areas, make sure I'm doing something on each. So I'll tend to set an annual goal or a 5-year goal or whatever. And then it helps because you're not, typically something will be going well or badly across one of those, but there's always something else that's doing a bit better. So, okay, my professional career might have been completely rubbish for the last 6 months, but you know what? At least I got to do that running race I'd always wanted to do. So I think for me, it's, how do you do these things? I personally, it's a bit of a bugbear. I don't love the phrase work-life balance, because balance gives you that sense of scales, and it gives you that sense that somehow work is directly in opposition for life, and you add to one by taking the other. I don't think that's the case. I think people demonstrably get enormous fulfillment and satisfaction out of their work, and the people who are happy tend to be those ones who actually enjoy the people they work with and the satisfaction. So I think balance in that sense of, think about the different parts of your life, friends and families, your sort of offline interest, your intellectual curiosity, your daily work, whatever, any athletic stuff you do. Try and keep all of those in balance. Absolutely. I think that helps sort of maintain those.
I think it's so important to look at life and work and how they fit together, and what your priorities are in life, and how work can allow you to achieve those.
Yeah, and I think if I've occasionally seen, I've quite frequently, if I'm honest, seen people who've just over focused on one aspect for too long. So if you just say, right, I'm just going to work insane hours and just get to this next level or whatever, and you think, okay, but if that came at the cost of, did you neglect friends and family? Did you neglect the fact that actually you used to love doing this volunteering work and you let that drop? Is that really the right thing in the long term? Anybody can work super hard for a short concentrated period and pass that exam or do whatever, but we've all got that same 168 hours a week, and ultimately your decision is, how do I choose to spend that time? By the time I've done a bit for sleep and a bit for living, there's only so much you can do in these areas.
It's quite a specific question here. I don't know if you'll be able to answer it, but I think I'll ask it anyway. Student in our final year of a joint honours in comparative literature and music. I adore natural history and wonder if there are opportunities to combine natural history with sound design, art installations at the museum. I hope to do a master's which would incorporate curation too.
Yeah, no, so great question, and congratulations, good luck with the finals. Not an easy period, I know. Short answer is yes. In fact, we're actually in the process of putting in place. It's a slight watch this space because I don't want to pre-install it, but we are doing quite a lot of work with artists now about precisely those installations, and it's backed for that. How do you create a really compelling environment that just communicates beyond just the days of we communicate in the museum through that little blank card with 20 words. That's not very compelling. Sound, artistic interpretation, all of these things can be really, really powerful ways of getting messages and stories across. And I think there's huge scope for that. If you think about when we sit down and try and design an exhibition, something like Fantastic Beasts, which is the one we're running right now, that's all about the sensory, the oral, visual experience. It's about trying to get people, and you are trying to get both an intellectual and an emotional response to that. So I think there's huge potential to do this, and as we know, music and art and literature can be very powerful means of tapping into emotions.
Yeah, I think we've seen that more locally as well, at the university involved in, or other organisations that have been able to do that and work with the community and bring people in. So definitely opportunities with different museums and organisations. Okay, let me just see. We've got just a couple of minutes left.
Yeah, got a couple of minutes left.
Just end on one question. That quite a lot of the questions are fairly similar, but when you look back on your life, when you think back to when you were a student, is there anything that you wish you knew then that you know now?
So much. Yeah, so much. I mean, I think it's a tricky one. I think if I was going to say there's one thing, maybe looking back, it's almost that sense that there are a couple of things you can't change. You can't change the number of hours in a week. You also can't change the direction of time's arrow. And, and therefore, when opportunities come up, I almost all of my regrets, looking back, have been regrets when there was an opportunity and I didn't take it. I think you raised that question. I didn't take the risk, or I couldn't quite be bothered, or wasn't there, or I thought there would be time later. And it's not that there isn't. It's just that life runs in this one-way linear direction. The physicists will tell you, as far as we're aware, time's arrow is not reversible, and all this sort of thing. So I think if I had my time again, I would tell me, there've been times when there were things I could have done, and for a variety of reasons, some good, some bad, just didn't seize those opportunities and perhaps missed experiences that, may not come around again. So yeah, so if that's for what it's worth, when the opportunity's there, grab them with both hands, and I think you'll probably enjoy it more than if you don't.
Yeah. Apologies if anyone can hear my snoring dog behind me. She's getting quite loud. Thank you so much, Doug. That's been so inspiring, and also a lot of reassurance, and encouragement to the students to make the most of their time at university, and to just really go out there and try and achieve what they want to achieve and not be held back. It's been really interesting. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolute pleasure. Yeah.
Good luck. I know you've been at the museum for about 10 months now, so I'm sure you'll be
about
there
11
for a lot
months
longer.
now, yeah.
So I hope you enjoy the rest of your time there, and any other ventures that you may have in the future.
Thank you so much. Best of luck, everybody. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, everyone.